He didn't even look up from his phone when he slid the papers across the table. That was the part Elena would never forget. Not the papers themselves. Not the cold click of his wedding ring against the marble when he set it down beside the documents like punctuation at the end of a sentence he'd already stopped caring about. It was the phone. The way Dante Veyron, feared by every crime family from Boston to Baltimore, couldn't be bothered to meet his wife's eyes when he ended 5 years of marriage. He just kept scrolling. "I had my lawyer finalize everything this week," he said. "The townhouse in Georgetown is yours. The accounts I opened in your name, you keep those. I think we've both wasted enough time." Elena Marlowe Veyron sat across from him at the long dining table. Rain hit the windows behind her in slow, heavy sheets. The chandelier above them threw pale gold light across the divorce papers, across the perfectly centered pen he'd placed beside them, across the hand that hadn't moved since he pushed everything toward her. She read the first page, then the second. Her face did not change. She picked up the pen, signed where the tabs indicated, turned each page with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. The household accounts, the dinner arrangements, the way she managed to be in whatever room Dante needed her in without ever being asked. 5 years of making herself useful and invisible at the same time. When she finished, she placed the pen back exactly where she'd found it. She removed her wedding ring, set it on top of the papers, stood up. "Elena." His voice carried something that almost sounded like surprise, like some part of him had expected the scene to play differently. She didn't answer him. She didn't look at him with wounded eyes or a trembling lip, didn't give him the spectacle of a woman falling apart, didn't offer him the comfort of knowing she was destroyed. She walked out of the dining room without her heels making a sound on the floor, went upstairs, and came back down 11 minutes later with one suitcase. 1. Dante was still in the dining room. She could see him standing at the window when she passed, staring out at the rain. He had his hands in his pockets. He looked like a man who just made a sound business decision and was already thinking about the next thing. Elena walked out the front door of the Calderon estate. The night swallowed her whole. Dante poured himself a drink. He'd expected a fight. That was the honest truth he wouldn't have admitted to anyone. But it sat in his chest like a splinter. He'd expected her to cry, expected the accusations, expected her to throw something or threaten to call her lawyer or beg him to reconsider. That was what women did when their husbands ended things. That was what people did when the ground shifted under their feet. Elena had signed this papers like she was approving a catering order. He swallowed the bourbon and told himself it was relief. For 5 years, he had built the Veyron organization into something that made old men nervous and young ones ambitious. The East Coast operation, freight, finance, the political connections that kept federal investigations stalled and rival families at a respectful distance, all of it his. Inherited from his father and his uncle Victor, reshaped and expanded by his own hand. He had turned a legacy operation into something modern, something clean-looking on the surface and brutal underneath. Elena had been part of the surface, the wife who attended dinners and said appropriate things and never embarrassed him and never pried. She was beautiful in the way that made people notice her and then immediately forget her because she never did anything interesting enough to hold attention. She cooked sometimes, read a lot, went to bed early when he had meetings that ran late, never asked what the meetings were about. He thought he wanted that. A woman who didn't ask questions. Now the house was quiet in a way that felt wrong, like a sound he'd gotten used to had stopped, and he couldn't name what it was. He poured a second drink and went upstairs. 32 minutes after the front door closed, his phone rang. The man on the other end was one of his gate guards. A veteran, 12 years with the Veyron organization, not a man who spooked easily. "Boss?" His voice had something in it. Not panic, something older than panic. "You need to come downstairs." "What is it?" A pause. I'm not sure how to describe it." Dante set down the glass. By the time he reached the top of the staircase, he could already see it through the tall windows at the front of the house. Light. Not street lights. Something else. He crossed to the window and looked down at the private road that ran from the gate to the estate's circular drive. One black Rolls-Royce sat at the front, headlights burning through the rain. Then another pulled up behind it, then another behind that. He counted. He stopped counting at 15 and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something that preceded understanding, that came from the body before the brain caught up. His fingers pressed against the cold glass. Outside, the cars kept arriving. Identical. All of them black. All of them moving in tight, disciplined convoy formation, parking with the kind of precision that didn't come from civilians. By the time the procession stopped, 32 black Rolls-Royces lined his road. He'd never seen anything like it. He knew men who could afford Rolls-Royces. He knew operations large enough to move in convoy. He knew security details and private armies and the various theatrical gestures that powerful men use to remind each other of their reach. He had never seen 32 of anything arranged in the rain outside a private estate at 2 in the morning. The doors opened. Men stepped out. More men than the cars should have been able to hold. He'd do the math later and still not make sense of it. They were dressed in dark clothing. Some wore earpieces. They arranged themselves along the road with a practiced economy of movement that told him they'd done this before. Not trained like his people were trained. Trained differently. Trained the way old organizations trained, where the discipline came not from fear of what the boss would do, but from something that had been built over generations. He was counting men when he noticed the woman. She emerged from the third car. Elderly, small, wearing a black coat so perfectly tailored it looked like it had been made specifically for standing in the rain without being diminished by it. White hair. A face that had gone past the age of expression into something quieter and more absolute. She walked through the parted rows of men without looking at any of them. She stopped in front of Elena and lowered her head. Not a bow. Something more restrained than that. An acknowledgement. The way someone lowers their head in the presence of a person who has earned it. Madame Marlowe, the woman said. Her voice was quiet, but in the strange way of the night and the rain, Dante could hear it through the glass. Your family has been waiting for you. Elena said something he couldn't hear. The old woman stepped back. 2 men moved forward and took Elena's suitcase. She didn't look up at the house. She didn't look at the window where Dante stood with both hands pressed against the glass, like a man who'd just walked into a wall in the dark. She got into the third Rolls-Royce. The doors closed. The 32 cars moved. Within 4 minutes, the road was empty. Dante stood at the window for a long time after they were gone. The rain kept coming. The lights on the empty road reflected on wet pavement and then went dark as each car turned out of his sight. He stood there until there was nothing left to look at. Then he went back to the dining room. The divorce papers were still on the table, the pen, the ring. He looked at the ring for the first time that night. Actually looked at it. Simple band, white gold. He'd picked it out in 40 minutes because he had other things to do that day. She'd never complained about it. He sat down heavily in the chair she'd been sitting in. He'd been afraid of a lot of things in his life. He'd been afraid of his father, and then his father's enemies, and then the weight of running something that never slept. He'd been afraid of specific men who were capable of specific violence. He'd been afraid in the way people who do dangerous things are afraid. Practically, tactically, with contingency plans already in motion. He had not been afraid of his wife. He pulled out his phone and called his head of intelligence. The man picked up on the second ring, still half asleep. Boss, Marlowe, Dante said. I need everything you have on anyone named Marlowe. East Coast, old money, old connections, family with a syndicate history. Pull it all. A pause. The sound of movement. You mean the Marlowe family? They've been dormant for over a decade. There was a collapse. Internal. Something went wrong inside the family about 12 years back. The patriarch died. The organization disintegrated. We looked at picking up some of the territory at the time, but there was nothing left to... What was the patriarch's name? Marlowe, Thomas Marlowe. He had... Another pause. The kind that followed when someone was connecting dots and didn't like where the line was going. He had a daughter. Dante looked at the ring on the table. Find out where she went, he said. Bus. Elena Marlowe did not cry in the car. She hadn't cried since she was 19 years old, standing in a hospital corridor, while a doctor used careful language to tell her that her father's injuries were not survivable, and she'd understood then that crying was something she would have to do very quickly and very privately, and then put away, because there was no one left to hold the rest of it together if she came apart. She had not come apart. She sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce now, and Margaret, the old woman in the black coat, who had been her father's most trusted strategist and had stayed in hiding alongside Elena for 12 years, sat across from her and watched her with the specific concern of someone who had earned the right to say nothing. "You didn't have to come yourself," Elena said. "You could have sent the cars." "I sent the cars," Margaret said. "I also came myself." Elena looked out the window. He was watching from the upstairs window. "I know." "Good." It was not satisfaction. Elena was not built for satisfaction at other people's expense in the petty way. That had been trained out of her early because petty satisfaction made you sloppy, made you stop paying attention. But she had spent 5 years managing the optics of a woman who did not matter, and there was something clean about the end of it. Something like exhaling after holding your breath for longer than your lungs were designed to hold it. "The archive," she said. "Activated as of 40 minutes ago," Margaret told her. "Your authentication triggered the protocols. The board has been notified." "Who else knows?" "The families that need to know." A pause. "And someone leaked it." Elena turned from the window. "Who?" "We don't know yet. The activation signal went to 12 recipients. By the time I was in the car, it had reached at least 3 of those recipients' rivals." Margaret's hands were folded in her lap. They didn't move when she said it, which meant she was choosing her words. "Someone inside our notification chain is passing information." The car moved through rain-dark streets. Elena thought about the 12 names on that list. She'd built the list herself. She'd spent 3 years building it, testing each person in small ways, watching for the kind of leakage that betrayed divided loyalty. "Was Sable on the notification list?" she said. Margaret looked at her. A very specific kind of look, the kind that came before news that hadn't been figured out yet. "Victor Sable is not a Marlowe affiliate." "No," Elena said. "He's Dante's consigliere, his uncle. And I've spent 6 months watching him move in ways that don't add up if you only look at the Veyron side of the ledger." She pulled out her phone, opened a secure message thread, slid it across to Margaret. The old woman read it. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, the particular sharpening that happened when someone recognized a threat they hadn't expected to recognize. "When did you put this together?" Margaret said quietly. 6 months ago, when the first anomaly appeared in the shipping data. "You told no one." "I told Dante. Indirectly." Margaret looked up. "He didn't listen," Elena said. The car turned off the main road. Through the tinted windows, Elena could see the outer boundary of the Marlowe estate. Dark fencing, old trees, the specific quality of darkness that surrounded a property that had been protected for decades. She hadn't been back in 3 years. Not since the last time she'd managed to slip away from Dante's world for 48 hours without raising questions. "The archive activation," she said, "wasn't just notification, it was a signal." "To whom?" "To whoever has been waiting." She took the phone back. "If I'm right about Victor Sable, he's been waiting for the Veyron organization and the Marlowe organization to separate from each other. He's been waiting for exactly what happened tonight." "The divorce." "The divorce," Elena confirmed. "Because as long as I was in that house, he couldn't move against either of us without moving against both. And we were watching each other's blind spots, whether Dante realized it or not." She paused. "Now we're separated. Now he moves." "What do you need?" Margaret said. Elena thought about the dining room, the papers, the pen, the ring, the way Dante had been looking at his phone. "I need you to tell me," she said carefully, "how much of the Marlowe network is still intact." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "More than anyone knows," she said. "Good," Elena said, "because I think we're going to need it." The first encrypted message arrived at Dante's headquarters at 4:09 a.m. His head of communications flagged it immediately. It came through a channel that should have been impossible to reach. A closed system, internal routing, the kind of infrastructure that took years and significant investment to build. Nobody sent messages through that channel. It existed as a last resort for internal emergencies. The message contained 4 words. "The Marlowe archive has been activated." Dante read it standing at his desk in shirt sleeves, the bourbon long abandoned. His head of intelligence was on a laptop across from him. 3 of his captains were on the phone with their own people. "What's the Marlowe archive?" one of the captains asked. Something old, Dante said. The intelligence chief looked up from his screen. Boss. The Marlowe family. The daughter. Her name was Elena. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when everyone in them understands at the same time that the shape of the problem is larger than they thought. Dante sat down. He thought about 5 years of quiet dinners, her reading in the library, the way she'd once excused herself from a meeting he'd accidentally held in the wrong room. Not embarrassed, just smoothly absent, there and then not there. The way she listened. He'd always thought she listened the way a careful woman listened, attentively but without real comprehension of what she was hearing. He thought about how she'd signed those papers. No hesitation, no questions. She'd known exactly what she was signing, exactly what it meant, and she'd done it with the efficiency of someone who had already planned for every consequence. Find out, he said quietly, what the Marlowe archive is. Find out who has access to it. Find out... He stopped, started again. Find out everything she would have had access to from inside this house. Nobody moved for a second. Then everyone moved at once. By 4:47 a.m., 3 of his financial accounts were frozen. By 5:15 a.m., 2 of his captains had called in their resignations. Not angry resignations. Quiet ones. The kind where people had already made arrangements. By 6 o'clock a.m., a meeting he'd held in absolute secrecy 3 weeks ago. 7 men, a secured room, everything locked down, had been summarized in a morning news brief by a journalist who should not have known it existed. Dante sat in the silence of his headquarters and understood for the first time what it felt like to be taken apart from the inside. He picked up his phone. He called the one number he hadn't wanted to call. It rang twice before she answered. Dante. Elena's voice was the same as it had always been, calm, measured, slightly lower than you expected from someone her size. We need to talk, he said. A pause. Yes, she said. We do. They met in a place neither of them had chosen. An abandoned Marlowe theater on the edge of the city, dark for 15 years, smelling of dust and old velvet. It had been Margaret's suggestion, neutral ground, she'd called it, and Elena had understood what she meant, a place that belonged to neither of them anymore, a place from before everything. Elena arrived first. Dante arrived 8 minutes later with 4 of his men, then stopped at the door and looked at her across the empty theater. Just us, she said. He looked at his men, made a gesture. They stayed outside. He walked toward her down the long aisle between the rows of dusty seats. The emergency lighting threw thin yellow light across everything. He looked older than he'd looked 6 hours ago. That happened sometimes, crisis-aged people in real time. She'd watched it happen to her father once. You need to tell me who you are, he said. You know who I am. I know your name. Then you know enough to start. He stopped a few feet from her. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved across her face in the way they moved when he was cataloging information. She'd always noticed that about him, the way he looked at things, people, situations, the way he took inventory. It was one of the things that made him good at what he did. He saw. He just hadn't looked at her. Your father, he said. Thomas Marlowe. Yes. He was supposed to be dead. He is dead. He died 4 years ago, in a house in Vermont that no one knew about. She paused. He lived long enough to see the network stabilize. That mattered to him. The network you've been running, rebuilding, there's a difference. Dante pressed one hand against the back of a dusty seat. Not for balance, for something to grip. For how long? The rebuilding started before I met you. And the marriage, she looked at him directly, was not a strategy. I want that to be clear. Whatever you're about to decide to believe about my motives, I need you to understand that I didn't marry you to position the Marlowe organization. I married you because I thought... She stopped, started again. I thought you were going to be different from what you turned out to be. Something moved through his expression. Not quite pain. The layer below pain, where things hadn't quite become feeling yet. What did you think I was going to be? He said. She didn't answer that. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was private in a way she wasn't going to hand to him in an abandoned theater at dawn. 6 months ago, she said instead, I found evidence of activity inside your organization that didn't align with your directives. Financial movement, personnel contact. Someone building something parallel to your operation, using your resources and your relationships and your trust, and routing the results somewhere else. Victor, he said. His voice went flat. Yes. You know this. I've known it for 6 months. You didn't tell me. I told you, she said. In every way I could tell you without handing you documentation, you would have immediately questioned the source of, which would have led to you asking questions about the source, which would have led to questions I wasn't ready to answer. I told you that something was wrong. I told you to look more carefully at the fourth quarter shipping reports. I told you that 3 of your captains were spending time in places that didn't make sense. I told you, Dante, and I thought you were being cautious. He said it like he was reading from a list of charges against himself. Flat, exact. I thought you were a careful woman who worried too much. Yes. I didn't listen. No. He stood with that for a moment. In the thin yellow light, with the smell of old velvet around them, and the rain coming down outside, he looked like a man who had run a very long distance and arrived at the wrong place. Then the lights came on. Not the emergency lighting, the full house lights, blazing suddenly across the theater with the violence of something switched on all at once. Elena didn't move. Dante spun around. His hand went to his jacket. Behind them, on the stage, screens had descended from the rigging, large, white, the kind used for projection in a theater of this size. They flickered and resolved into images. Photographs. Financial records. Coded communications laid out in decoded columns. Documents that went back decades. Family names, territories, alliances built in private and recorded in the kind of careful language that meant something specific to people who knew how to read it. Victor Sable's face appeared on the center screen. Dante went very still. Elena watched him absorb it. She'd had weeks to do her absorbing. She understood that he was doing in 30 seconds what had taken her months, and she didn't rush him. He's not working alone, she said quietly. He's built a coalition, 7 families. 2 banking partners, a prosecutor who's been sitting on an investigation into your operation for 3 years and whose inaction has been purchased. He's going to make a move. He already has. The accounts that froze this morning, that's him. Your captains who resigned, he got to them first. The leaked meeting, she gestured at the screen. That was a demonstration. He wanted you to know someone was inside. He wanted you afraid and reactive. Dante turned to look at her. His face had settled into something she recognized, not the cold performance of control she'd spent 5 years watching from across dinner tables, but the real thing underneath it, the place where Dante Veyron actually lived. What does he want? Dante said. Everything, she said. Both organizations, both bloodlines. Not your territory, not the network, everything. He wants to be the last one standing when 2 houses collapse into each other. Silence. Outside, the rain came harder. Dante looked at the screen, at his uncle's face, at 12 years of documents that laid out the architecture of a betrayal that had been built slowly and carefully, and with the patience of someone who understood that the longest plays were the most devastating ones. Then he looked at Elena. She looked back. They had stood this way before, across tables, across rooms, across the specific distance of 2 people who had lived in the same house without ever quite reaching each other. But this was different. There was no performance on either side of it now, no careful management of what was shown and what was kept back. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, you could walk away from this. I know. The Marlowe organization is intact enough. You could take it, rebuild quietly, let Victor take me apart, and then consolidate while he's weakened. Yes. That would be the smart play. Probably. He waited. She let him wait. I'm not going to, she said, but not because of the marriage, not because of what we were, because whoever wins this the easy way, by letting the other one burn, ends up having to deal with Victor afterward. And Victor with everything is a problem neither of us solves alone. Dante looked at her for a long time. Together then. As partners, she said, not as husband and wife, that's done. As 2 people who understand what the other has been protecting and can use that. He nodded, slowly. The nod of someone who understood that the ground had changed and that the old maps were gone. He extended his hand. She looked at it, then she shook it. Outside, the 32 black Rolls-Royces waited in the dark. And somewhere in the city, Victor Sable received a message on his phone that made him smile. He had no idea that the two people he'd spent 12 years trying to separate had just decided, in an abandoned theater that smelled of dust and old velvet, to do the one thing he hadn't planned for: work together. If this story is hitting close to home, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what Victor Sable does next, and what Elena and Dante uncover about the man pulling everyone's strings, that is something you do not want to walk into without context. Like this video so more people find it. And stay with me, because this story is only getting started. The handshake lasted 2 seconds. Dante released her hand first. Elena had expected that. He was not a man comfortable with the optics of deference, even when the situation called for it, even when the person across from him had just handed him a lifeline he hadn't earned. He released her hand and stepped back and turned toward the stage screens, and she could see him already doing what he did. Compartmentalizing, cataloging, building the new map on top of the wreckage of the old one. "Victor will move fast," he said. "Now that the accounts are flagged, he knows I know something is wrong. He won't wait." "He's already moving," Elena said. "He moved the moment I signed those papers." Dante looked at her sideways. "You expected this?" "I expected him to accelerate. I didn't know the exact mechanism." She pulled her coat tighter, not from cold, from habit, from the specific physical gesture of a person gathering themselves. "He's been watching us for 2 years, maybe longer. Every time we had friction, every time you and I were in the same room and the temperature dropped, he was noting it, measuring it. He recommended the divorce lawyer." The theater went quiet. Elena looked at him. "Say that again." "The lawyer. My lawyer. Victor recommended him 8 months ago. Said the man was discreet, handled complex asset situations, no paper trail problems." Dante's voice had gone to somewhere below flat. "I didn't think anything of it." "Victor recommended your divorce lawyer," Elena said slowly, 8 months ago. "Before I'd even decided—" He stopped. "Before you'd decided to divorce me." The sentence sat between them in the dusty air, like something that had been set down and couldn't be picked back up. Dante turned away from her and walked 3 steps toward the stage. His back was to her. She watched his shoulders, not because she was looking for vulnerability, but because people's shoulders told you things their faces were trained to hide. His were rigid in a way that meant he was recalculating everything backward from this moment, applying the new information to every memory that had led here, and finding that the picture changed in ways he hadn't prepared for. "He put the idea in my head," Dante said. "I don't know that." "I do." He turned around. His face was controlled, but his jaw had the particular tightness of a man biting down on something. 7 months ago, he started saying things. Nothing direct. Victor never does anything direct. Just observations. That you seemed unhappy. That the household felt strained. That he'd noticed you spending time alone. He exhaled through his nose. "I thought he was looking out for me." "He was manufacturing a reason." "He was manufacturing a reason," Dante repeated. She watched him absorb that, the specific cruelty of it, that the man who'd built the case for the divorce had also set up the divorce lawyer, had engineered the separation of the two people whose combined resources he needed separated before he could take them both apart. It was patient work, the kind of patience that came from genuine hatred disguised as loyalty. "He's known about the Marlowe archive for a long time," Elena said. "Longer than you have." Dante looked at her. "How long?" "That's what I need to find out." They left the theater separately. Elena went back to the Marlowe estate with Margaret and 2 of the senior archive managers, people who'd spent 12 years in careful obscurity, maintaining a network that looked dormant to everyone who wasn't looking at the right layers of it. The drive back took 40 minutes. She spent 38 of them on her phone. By the time she walked through the estate's front door, she had 4 confirmed reports of unusual contact between Victor Sable's people and 3 of the families he'd supposedly been managing on Dante's behalf. Not just unusual contact, financial transfers. Small ones, sized to stay below the thresholds that triggered automatic review. The kind of sizing that required familiarity with the specific review systems in use. "He has someone inside your archive," Margaret said. She said it quietly, in the hallway outside the main strategy room, before the doors opened and the others could hear. Elena stopped walking. Explain that. The transfers were timed. Margaret held out a tablet. Not a commercial device, something older and more specific, the kind of hardware built for organizations that didn't trust commercial supply chains. On it, a column of timestamps. 3 of those transfers happened within 40 minutes of archive access events. Not the activation, earlier accesses, routine management queries. Elena looked at the timestamps. The access logs show authorized credentials, Margaret said. But the timing, someone is using legitimate credentials to pull information and then passing it out. Elena handed the tablet back. Who has authorization at that level? 7 people, all vetted, all long-term. Vet them again. She paused, and pull the secondary logs. Not the access events, the system behavior around them. Processing time, query patterns, anything that looks like a pull rather than a read. Margaret nodded. There's something else. She hesitated in the way she hesitated when the news was worse than the preface. One of the 7 authorized users has been offline for 6 days. Offline how? Unreachable. Phone, secure line, dead drop, nothing. Name. Carver, Margaret said. James Carver. Carver. Your father's... I know who Carver is. Elena's voice didn't change. She was very careful about her voice not changing. 6 days. Since before the divorce. She stood in the hallway with that for 3 seconds. Exactly 3. She counted, because counting was the thing she did when the thing she wanted to do was something else entirely. Find him, she said. Quietly. And until we know what happened to him, treat his credentials as compromised. That degrades our secure communication by 40%. I know. She pushed open the doors to the strategy room and walked in, and her face was the same face it had always been. Dante's morning got worse in increments. By 9 a.m., he'd confirmed that the financial freezes weren't random. They were surgical, targeting specifically the accounts linked to 3 of his largest legitimate-facing operations. The kind of targeting that required knowledge of which accounts were actually connected to which operations, which was information that did not exist on paper anywhere. It existed in the heads of maybe 4 people and in the operational memory of his internal system. By 10, he was sitting across from his head of internal security, a man named Breck, who had been with the Veyron organization since before Dante took it over. I need to know, Dante said, who in this building has had contact with my uncle in the last 90 days outside of scheduled meetings? Breck was a careful man. Not slow, careful. There was a difference. He thought before he answered, and he answered precisely. And in 12 years, Dante had never caught him adding color to a response to make himself look better. That's a difficult question to answer cleanly, Breck said. Why? Because Victor attends meetings here regularly. He has standing access. Corridor conversations, informal contact. We don't log that. What do you log? Scheduled meetings, electronic communication through our systems, visitor access to secured areas. Breck paused. And anomalies. What anomalies? Another pause. Longer. 3 weeks ago, there was an access event in the archive level, after hours. The credential used belonged to Marcus Vale. Dante went still. Marcus has archive access. Yes, he's your legal advisor. He's had archive access for 4 years. What was he accessing? We flagged it but didn't escalate because the credential was legitimate. He accessed the operational correspondence archive. Specifically, Breck looked at a page in the folder he'd brought. Communications logs from the period when the Marlowe organization was still active, 12 to 15 years ago. The silence in the room was a specific kind. The kind that preceded a restructuring of what had been assumed. Marcus Vale, Dante said, was pulling information on the Marlowe family. 3 weeks ago, yes. Before the divorce. Before the divorce. Dante stood up. He didn't do it for effect. He did it because sitting still had stopped being possible. He walked to the window and stood there with his hands clasped behind him and thought about Marcus Vale, who he'd known for 11 years. Who had navigated the legal architecture of the Veyron organization with the specific competence of a man who understood both the legitimate and the illegitimate simultaneously, who had never, in 11 years, given him a single reason for suspicion. "Where's Marcus now?" he said. "Scheduled to be in his office at noon. Board review meeting at 2. "I want someone on him," Dante said. "Not confrontational. Surveillance. Everything." He turned around. "And I want to know, Breck, I want you to personally verify whether Marcus Vale has had any contact with Victor Sable in the last 6 months that doesn't appear in our regular logs." Breck closed his folder. "If that's true, boss, if that's true," Dante said, "then the problem is bigger than Victor." Elena called him at 11:47. He picked up before the second ring. She noticed that and filed it away without comment. "Carver is missing," she said. "Who's Carver?" "One of 7 people with high-level access to the Marlowe archive. He's been unreachable for 6 days. His credentials may be compromised." She was walking while she talked. The estate's east corridor, long and cold and empty, the kind of space she used when she needed to think in motion. "Someone has been using authorized access to pull timing-sensitive information and passing it outside the archive. The transfers align with the access events. Someone inside your organization is feeding Victor. Or feeding whoever Victor is working for." A pause. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't think Victor is at the top of this," she said. "Victor is smart, but this architecture, the patience, the depth of it, the way it uses both of our blind spots simultaneously, Victor doesn't think this way. Victor is a blunt instrument that learned to look sharp." "You think there's someone above him?" "I think Victor was given a framework and told to execute it. I think the person who designed the framework has been watching both of us for a very long time." She stopped walking. Outside the corridor window, the estate grounds were gray and wet, the old trees moving in a cold wind. "Marcus Vale." Another pause. Longer. "How do you know that name?" Dante said. "I know a lot of names," she said. "I've had 5 years of access to your world. Not deep access. I made sure never to learn things that weren't offered, but ambient information adds up." She paused. "Your legal advisor has been with the Veyron organization for 11 years. He would have been there during the period when the Marlowe collapse happened." "He was." "Did he advise on the Marlowe territory acquisition? The conversations your organization had about moving into the space after my family disappeared?" Silence. "Dante." "He was in those meetings," Dante said. His voice had gone to the place below controlled. Not angry, not scared, something anterior to both. "He was in all of those meetings. Then he knows exactly what the Marlowe network looked like before it went dark. He knows the architecture. He knows which pieces were worth preserving." She let that settle. "And 3 weeks ago, he accessed your archive to pull communications from that exact period. My head of security told me about the access event an hour ago." "Then we're looking at the same thing from different directions," she said, "and we're arriving at the same place." She heard him exhale. Long and controlled, the way he exhaled when he was managing something physical. The specific breath of a man who ran on forward momentum learning to stand still in a problem. "I'm putting surveillance on Marcus," he said. "Don't," she said immediately. "Why?" "Because if Marcus is as careful as I think he is, he'll notice. And if he notices, he'll accelerate. Whatever the end game is," she pressed her fingers against the cold window glass. "We're not ready for the end game." "Then what do we do?" "We let him think everything is proceeding the way he designed it. We appear to be falling apart. Your organization destabilized, mine just activated, and therefore visible and vulnerable. We look like exactly what he wants us to look like." She paused. "And we work backward through everything he would have needed access to in order to build this. That could take weeks." "We have less than that." A sound from his end. Not quite a laugh, something adjacent to it. The sound people made when a situation achieved a kind of absurdity that bypassed normal response. "You know what the worst part of this is? There are a lot of candidates. The worst part," Dante said, "is that I've been sitting across from Marcus Vale for 11 years watching him be the smartest person in every room and thinking it was competence." "It is competence," Elena said. "It's just not in your service." The afternoon brought 3 things in quick succession, none of them good. The first was a message from one of Elena's contacts inside a federal monitoring office. Not an official contact, someone who owed the Marlowe family a debt old enough to have been nearly forgotten. The message said that a sealed investigation file, sitting untouched for 3 years, had been reviewed that morning by someone at the prosecutorial level. The investigation concerned Dante Veyron. The review had been requested by a third party whose name was redacted in the notification. The second was a phone call to Dante from one of the families he'd considered allied, a man named Reyes, who ran a transportation network out of Philadelphia and who had shaken Dante's hand at 2 different tables over the years and meant it. Reyes called at 2:15 p.m. and said carefully that he was going to need to step back from their current arrangements. Nothing personal. Circumstances had changed. He wished Dante well. The third was a photograph. It arrived in Elena's secure message system at 2:40 p.m. No sender identification, no context, just an image, a parking structure, taken from a high angle, showing 2 men standing beside a car. One of the men was Victor Sable. The other was James Carver. Carver, her missing archive manager. The man who'd been unreachable for 6 days. In the photograph, they were shaking hands. Elena looked at the image for a long time. Then she forwarded it to Margaret with a single line. Pull everything Carver accessed in the last 90 days. Every query, every file, every search parameter. Margaret's response came back in 4 minutes. Already running. Elena, there's more. She called Margaret instead of typing back. The secondary log analysis you requested, Margaret said. Her voice had the quality of someone delivering damage estimates. The query patterns around the compromised access events. They're not random. They're systematic. Someone has been building a specific file using the archive as a source. What kind of file? A succession document, Margaret said. Someone has been pulling the components of the Marlowe succession protocol, the full transfer architecture, how the network authority moves, who has to authenticate it, what the trigger conditions are. Elena sat down. She hadn't meant to. Her legs made the decision without consulting her. They're trying to replicate the succession protocol, she said, or they already have a version of it. The queries suggest they've been building this for at least 4 months. Can a replicated protocol activate the archive transfer? A pause. If it's accurate enough, if it has the right authentication signatures, it could trigger a partial transfer. Not the full activation, not with your biometric authentication locked in, but enough to redirect certain financial instruments, certain network authorities. How certain? The shipping routes, Margaret said, the political leverage files, the intelligence archives. Elena closed her eyes, not from despair, from the specific discipline of not reacting to the size of a problem before you've finished measuring it. They don't need to steal the whole organization, she said. No, Margaret said. They just need the pieces that make the rest of it vulnerable. Elena drove to see Dante herself. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to relay information through a secure channel and maintain the distance that the new arrangement called for. Partnership, not proximity. 2 organizations cooperating rather than 2 people resuming something that had already been signed away. But the photograph of Carver and the succession protocol findings weren't the kind of things you sent through a channel. They were the kind of things you put in front of a person and watched them respond to in real time, because how someone responded in the first 10 seconds told you things that no channel could transmit. She arrived at his headquarters at 3:30. His men were not happy to see her. She could feel the specific texture of that unhappiness as she walked through the building. The way people moved slightly differently around someone they were recalibrating their understanding of. She had been the boss's quiet wife for 5 years. Now she was something they hadn't processed yet, and that unprocessed quality made them formal, in the clumsy way of people who'd lost the script. Dante was alone in his office. He looked like he hadn't eaten since the night before, which was probably true. He had his jacket off and his sleeves pushed back, and there were 3 separate documents open on his desk, and he was doing the thing he did when he was working a problem, moving between them in a rotation, each one getting a minute of focus before he moved to the next. He looked up when she came in. "Carver," she said, and put her phone on the desk with the photograph showing. "My missing archive manager. That's him with Victor, 6 days ago." Dante looked at the photograph. His expression didn't change dramatically. A slight contraction around the eyes, the kind that meant information landing and being sorted. Victor's been running him. For at least 4 months, maybe longer. She stayed standing. The desk between them felt appropriate. Not hostile, just accurate. "Carver has been systematically extracting components of my family's succession protocol. Not the authentication layer. He can't replicate that. It's biometric, and it's mine. But the underlying architecture, the financial routing, the network authority structure. And if they have that, then they can redirect specific assets without triggering a full takeover. It's surgical. It's exactly what you'd design if you knew a full acquisition was impossible, but a partial dismantling was enough to create leverage. Dante leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not dramatically, just the particular upward gaze of someone thinking hard. They don't need to take everything. They need to take enough that neither of us can function. And then offer to sell it back, or use it as collateral to bring other families to heel. She paused. Or just destroy it, if the goal was never profit. What would the goal be if it wasn't profit? Control, she said. The old kind. The kind where you don't take what people have, you eliminate their ability to operate independently, and then you become the only functioning infrastructure. Every family, every operation, every route and relationship runs through one center. Dante looked at her. Marcus, he said. Marcus, she confirmed. He stood up. The movement was quick, not agitated, purposeful, the movement of a man who'd finished processing and was now operational. He walked around the desk and stopped a few feet from her, and for a moment they were just two people in a room with an ugly problem, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, and the particular tightness at the corner of his mouth that meant he was running on something below full capacity and managing it through will. He's been playing us both, Dante said. For years. Yes. Victor was the instrument. Carver was the access point. And Marcus has been the architect, she said. The divorce, the destabilization, the succession protocol extraction, it's all one plan, executed in sequence. And we walked into most of it because we were too busy not trusting each other to see what was coming from outside. Dante looked at her for a moment with something she hadn't seen from him before. Not admiration, not quite. Something more complicated. The look of a person revising a long-held assessment in real time. The meeting, he said. The emergency meeting the rival families are calling. It's on Friday. I know about the meeting. Victor is going to use it to announce he's replacing me as head of the Veyron organization. I know. If Marcus is controlling this, the meeting isn't just about you and me. It's the consolidation point, the place where he brings every piece together. He paused. Every family in the city in one room. Every piece of leverage his operation has collected. The meeting isn't a power play against the Veyron family. It's the mechanism, Elena said, for taking everything at once. The room settled around that understanding. Outside, traffic moved on the street below. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and was answered. Normal sounds of a world that didn't know what was being planned inside a private office on a gray Thursday afternoon. Dante's phone buzzed on the desk. He looked at it. His face changed. He picked it up and turned the screen toward her. The message was from a number he didn't recognize. Encrypted, short. Friday's meeting has been moved. Tomorrow night. Attendance mandatory. Veyron organization represented by Victor Sable. Marlowe succession transfer to take effect at midnight. Elena read it twice. Then she looked up. They moved the timeline, she said. By 4 days. Dante's voice was very quiet. Someone told them we were talking. She thought about that for 3 seconds. Thought about the surveillance on Carver that she'd ordered halted. Thought about the photograph that had arrived with no sender. Thought about the communication she'd had with Dante on the phone that morning. Secure, she'd believed, through the Marlowe channel. Someone told them, she said, or the photograph was sent to us on purpose. To do what? To make us have exactly the conversation we just had. In this building. On your communication systems. She looked at the phone in his hand. How secure is this office? A pause. A long one. It was swept this morning. By whom? He didn't answer. She watched his face and watched him arrive at the answer and watched what it did to him to get there. Breck runs the sweeps, he said. Who does Breck report to? Dante set the phone down on the desk with a very careful, very controlled movement that was the physical equivalent of not throwing it. Breck has been with the organization since before I took it over, he said. Who brought him in? He looked at her. Victor, he said. The word sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water, and the rings it made went outward and touched every wall. They had perhaps 18 hours before the meeting that was supposed to mark the end of both of their organizations. The man running security sweeps in this building had been placed here by the man trying to destroy it. The photograph that had prompted this conversation had been sent by an unknown party at a strategically precise moment. And somewhere in the city, Marcus Vale was sitting in a room Dante had paid for and waiting for a plan to complete itself. Elena looked at Dante. Dante looked at Elena. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that they had just run out of room to operate carefully. "We have until tomorrow night," she said. "That's not enough time." "No," she said. "It's not." She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd set it. "Then we'd better stop wasting it." Elena was already moving before she finished the sentence. She didn't wait for Dante to respond. Didn't wait for him to formulate the plan, or assign the roles, or take the lead in the way men like him took the lead, even when they were running on fumes and broken information. She picked up her coat, and as she was putting it on, she was already running the math. 18 hours, compromised security sweep, Breck placed by Victor, the office possibly live, every conversation they'd had in this room in the last 3 hours potentially recorded and transmitted. "Don't say anything else in this building," she said. Very quiet. Almost no lip movement. The way she'd learned to speak in rooms she didn't trust. Dante looked at her. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then looked at the ceiling. A small, deliberate look. Enough for him to follow it. His jaw tightened. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. They walked out of the office together, down the corridor, past 2 of his men who looked at Elena with the recalibrated formality she'd felt on the way in, into the elevator, down to the lobby, out through a side exit onto a gray afternoon street where buses moved and a food cart was doing business on the corner, and the world was proceeding with its ordinary indifference to private catastrophes. Dante walked beside her without speaking until they were half a block from the building. "How long?" he said. "I don't know. Long enough that anything we planned in that office is burned. Breck has been running the sweeps for 6 years. I know. If he's been planting devices, then Marcus has 6 years of operational intelligence on your organization." She kept walking, her heels on the wet pavement. "Don't stop moving. Don't look back at the building." He didn't. To his credit, he didn't. She'd half expected the impulse to be uncontrollable, to turn and look at the place where the betrayal lived, the physical need to confront it. But Dante walked forward with her and kept his eyes on the street ahead, and that told her something about him she hadn't had occasion to learn in 5 years of living in the same house. He could override himself when it mattered. "My car," she said. "Your driver is vetted. By me personally, over 3 years." They got in. The Rolls-Royce, not one of the convoy fleet, a single car, the one she used for private movement, pulled into traffic. The driver, a man named Hollis, who had worked for the Marlowe family since Elena was 17, raised the privacy partition without being asked. She called Margaret on the Marlowe encrypted line. "The office is compromised," she said. "Assume everything discussed there in the last, at minimum, 6 hours is known, possibly longer." Margaret's pause was very short. "Understood. We've been using secondary routing for the last 2 hours. The archive access analysis is complete." "Tell me." Carver pulled 47 documents over 4 months. The succession protocol components, as I said. But there's a 48th query, run 6 days ago, the same day Carver went dark. A breath. He pulled the authentication exception file. Elena felt the cold arrive in her chest before she understood why. "Repeat that," she said. "The authentication exception file," Margaret said. "The contingency your father built into the succession protocol for situations where the primary authenticator was incapacitated or unavailable." "That file," Elena said, "doesn't exist in the standard archive." "No," Margaret said. "It exists in a subsystem that Carver helped your father build 12 years ago." The car moved through traffic. Through the window, the city looked exactly the same as it always had. The same indifferent gray beauty of a place that continued operating regardless of what happened inside its buildings. "He knew it was there," Elena said. "From the beginning. He helped build it, and then he waited." 12 years, Margaret said. Dante was watching her face. She kept it still. "If they have the exception file," she said carefully, "and they have the protocol components, can they activate a transfer without my authentication?" The silence before Margaret's answer was the longest 3 seconds of Elena's adult life. Under specific conditions, Margaret said. If the primary authenticator is declared legally incapacitated or confirmed deceased, with documentation that passes the protocol's verification layer, the exception file can initiate a transfer to the designated secondary authority. Who is the designated secondary authority? Your father named it as the senior surviving Marlowe Council member. There are no surviving Marlowe Council members. There's one, Margaret said, a man named Edwin Rourke. He was peripherally involved with the Marlowe organization, not a primary member, a contractual associate. He went private 15 years ago. We lost track of him about 8 years back. A pause. Dante. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm looking at something that just came through the monitoring system. Someone filed a petition in the probate division this morning, declaring Elena Marlowe Veyron legally incapacitated due to psychological distress related to the dissolution of her marriage. The car stopped at a red light. They're going to commit me, Elena said. Not a question. The filing was accompanied by 2 psychiatric affidavits, both from licensed practitioners. The petition requests emergency guardianship proceedings and automatic suspension of her authority over the Marlowe estate assets, pending review. Dante's hand landed on the seat between them, not touching her, just present. She looked at it and then looked out the window. Where's Edwin Rourke? She said. We're locating him now. A pause. Elena, if they have him, if Marcus has been sitting on Rourke for years, the way he sat on everything else, then the transfer is already in motion, Elena said. The petition is the trigger. Once it's filed, the exception protocol reads it as the incapacitation event and begins the countdown to secondary authority activation. How long is the countdown? 24 hours, Elena said. My father built it in as a protection period, to allow the primary authenticator to contest. She closed her eyes, opened them. But to contest it, I have to appear in person before the protocol's verification layer, which exists inside the Marlowe archive, which is located inside the estate. Which they know, Dante said quietly. He'd been listening to her side of the conversation and assembled enough. Which they know, she confirmed. They've moved the family meeting to tomorrow night. The petition was filed this morning. By tomorrow night, if I haven't contested the incapacitation filing in person at the archive, the secondary authority activates, Edwin Rourke, or whoever is controlling him, assumes command authority over the Marlowe network, and the meeting becomes the venue where Marcus Vale presents a fully operational Marlowe organization as his. She took a breath. Combined with whatever remains of the Veyron organization after Victor finishes dismantling it. The red light turned green. We need to get to the estate, Dante said. We can't. Why? She looked at him. Because the estate is the one place they know I have to go. If they've been 12 years ahead of everything else, they're 12 minutes ahead of this. They drove. Not to the estate. Not to Dante's headquarters. Not to anywhere that either of their organizations had ever used. Dante made a call to a man who owed him a debt that predated the Veyron organization entirely. A debt from a time when Dante was 23 and had done something for someone that cost him significantly and had never been collected on. He collected it now. The place was a restaurant that had been closed for renovation for 2 months, empty and unlocked for people who knew the right contact. They sat in the dark kitchen with a small battery lamp on the stainless steel counter between them, and Dante's phone and Elena's phone were both off and in their pockets, and Margaret was reachable only through a third device Elena carried that had never been registered to any name. Walk me through the timeline, Dante said. His voice in the dark kitchen was different from his office voice, stripped of the performance layer that men in his position maintained even when they thought they weren't performing. This was the voice underneath, lower, more direct, with the particular roughness of someone who'd been awake for too long and was past the point where maintaining surfaces felt worth the energy. Marcus has been building this for at least 12 years, Elena said, possibly longer. The Marlowe collapse, the internal betrayal that destroyed my family's organization. We always believed it was an internal power struggle, a council member who moved against my father. And now I'm looking at the architecture of what's happening, and I'm thinking about how that collapse was structured, how precisely it targeted the right pressure points, how quickly it moved once it started. She paused. My father survived it, but wasn't supposed to survive it. He hid for 4 years, and I spent that time being told he was dead. He came back to me when I was 22 and spent the next 3 years transferring everything he could to me before he actually died. She looked at the battery lamp. He never told me who was behind the original betrayal. He said he didn't know with certainty, and he didn't want to give me a name I'd act on without proof. He suspected Marcus. He suspected someone with deep legal knowledge of both the Marlowe organization and the structures surrounding it. Someone who understood how to dismantle a family from the inside using its own succession architecture against it. She paused. Marcus Vale was 31 years old when the Marlowe collapse happened. He was a junior legal associate with a firm that did contractual work for my family. Dante went very still. He was there from the beginning, Dante said. He watched my father's organization fall, and he studied it, and then he spent the next decade positioning himself inside the Veyron organization, inside your world, waiting for the moment when the Marlowe network resurfaced. Because he knew it would. He knew my father had built the succession protocol. He knew it was waiting for activation. Her voice stayed level, steady. She'd had 20 minutes in the car to begin the process of accepting the scope of it, and what she'd learned in her life was that acceptance was not the same as surrender. Acceptance was what you did so that emotion didn't eat the clock. He needed two things. He needed the Marlowe network to reactivate, and he needed its primary authenticator, me, incapacitated or removed from the picture. The divorce was supposed to give him both: a destabilized woman, publicly discarded, emotionally compromised, a psychiatric petition that a judge would look at and think was plausible. He was counting on you to fall apart, Dante said. He was counting on me to behave the way he assumed a woman in my position would behave. Dante looked at her across the small battery light. His face in that light was all planes and shadows, older than his years in the way it got when the pretense was fully stripped away. He had a small cut above his left eyebrow that she hadn't noticed earlier. She didn't ask about it. "What do we do?" he said. "I need to get into the estate without going through any entrance that can be monitored." She pulled the third device from her pocket, the unregistered one. "And I need you to do something I'm not sure you're going to agree to. Tell me." "I need you to go to Victor." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The lamp buzzed faintly. "Explain that," Dante said. "Victor is Marcus's instrument, not his partner. Victor believes he's the beneficiary of this plan, that when it's over, he gets the Veyron throne and credit for bringing the Marlowe network into line. He doesn't know he's expendable. He doesn't know that Marcus has been building toward a consolidation that has no room for an old man with a grudge and a regional operation." She held his gaze. "You tell Victor the truth, not all of it. Enough. You tell him that Marcus has been using him and that the meeting tomorrow night is not the coronation Victor is expecting. And if Victor doesn't believe me, Victor is vain and he is greedy, and he is smart enough to know when a story has the texture of truth," she said. "The moment you show him the evidence of Marcus's long game, 12 years of positioning, the Marlowe succession architecture, the way Marcus has routed the financial transfers so that they end at accounts Victor has no access to, he'll believe you. Because the worst thing for a man like Victor isn't being manipulated. It's finding out he was manipulated by someone who considered him a means rather than an end." Dante was quiet for a long moment, thinking it through. She could see him doing it, not the visible deliberation of a man performing consideration, but the real thing, the interior movement of someone testing an idea against what they knew about human nature and finding the fit. "If I go to Victor," he said, "and he's more loyal to Marcus than I think, or if Marcus has him watched, which is likely, then Marcus knows we've found the seam in his plan," Elena said, "and he moves faster." "Which is already happening." "Yes. So the risk is the same either way." "The risk is the same either way," she confirmed, "but the upside is different. Victor as an enemy inside Marcus's coalition is worth more to us than Victor as a neutral player." Dante looked at his hands on the counter, then back at her. "And while I'm doing that, I get into the estate and contest the incapacitation filing before the 24 hours expire." She paused. "There's a secondary entrance, a tunnel access that predates the estate's current construction by 40 years. It's not in any record that Carver would have had access to. My father sealed that portion of the archive before Carver was ever brought into the organization." "You're certain?" "I'm certain about almost nothing right now," she said. "But I'm certain about that." She left Dante at the restaurant at 7 p.m. The city at that hour had the specific quality of an early autumn evening, cold coming in faster than the light, people moving with the purposeful hurry of those who wanted to be somewhere indoors. Elena moved with them and then diverged from them and made her way on foot 3 blocks east to where Hollis was waiting with the car in a parking structure. She told him where they were going. He didn't ask questions. He had worked for the Marlowe family for long enough that he'd learned asking questions was generally not a service he was providing. They drove 40 minutes outside the city to a property adjacent to the Marlowe estate, an overgrown parcel that had been purchased by a shell company 40 years ago and maintained in deliberate disrepair, unremarkable in the way that valuable things sometimes were when you needed them to be invisible. She went in on foot from there. The tunnel was exactly as she remembered it from the one time her father had walked her through it when she was 16. Damp, low-ceilinged, smelling of old stone and earth, the kind of space that reminded you how recently, in historical terms, a family's fortunes could change. She used a flashlight. She moved quickly. She came up into the estate's lower archive level through a door behind a shelving unit that had not been moved in years, judging by the dust on the floor around it. She was in the archive. The real archive, not the digitized system that Carver had been accessing, but the physical repository, temperature-controlled, with the particular hum of a space that had been carefully maintained. She went to the verification terminal. It was a piece of hardware that looked older than it was, deliberately styled to appear archaic, part of her father's philosophy that the best security looked like no security at all. She placed her palm on the reader, looked into the retinal scanner, said the verification phrase, a sentence her father had made her memorize at 19, made her repeat until it was as automatic as breathing. The terminal accepted her. The incapacitation contest was logged at 8:47 p.m. The countdown stopped. She stood in the silence of the archive for a moment, the first moment since the restaurant where she was not in motion, not managing information, not running calculations. She let herself have it. Not relief. Not quite. Something more like the moment after a very close call when your hands start shaking, not because you're scared, but because your body finally has permission to react. Her hands did not shake. She didn't let them. She was pulling her third device out to call Margaret when the archive lights came on. Full lights. Not the motion-sensitive low lighting that activated when she'd come in, the full overheads, bright and sudden, the way lights came on when someone who knew the system switched them on from a control point. Elena turned around. Edwin Rourke was standing at the far end of the archive. He was older than his file photographs, early 70s, with the kind of stillness that came from a life spent waiting. He wore a dark suit that fit him precisely, and had his hands clasped in front of him in the posture of someone who had been expecting her. Beside him were 2 men she didn't recognize, and behind them, emerging from the main archive entrance, the entrance she had deliberately avoided, was a woman Elena had known for 31 years. Margaret. Elena looked at her. Margaret looked back. Her face was the face it had always been. Careful, composed. The face of a woman who had given decades to the Marlowe family. But her eyes were doing something different. Not guilt, not shame. Something more settled than either of those things. Something that had made its peace with itself long ago. "How long?" Elena said. She asked it the way she asked things when she already knew the answer but needed to hear it spoken. "Your father asked me that too," Margaret said, "when he found out, 4 years before he died. And you stayed." "He asked me to." Margaret's voice was quiet, even. "He said he'd rather know exactly where I was than have me operating freely. He thought he could manage it." "He thought he could manage you?" "He thought a lot of things," Margaret said. "He was a brilliant man who loved you more than he loved being right. That was always his limitation." Elena looked at Edwin Rourke, at the 2 men, at the entrance behind them, the main entrance, which she had avoided because she'd assumed it was monitored. She'd been right that it was monitored. She'd been wrong about who was doing the monitoring. "The photograph," she said. "Carver and Victor. You sent it." "To make sure you had the right conversation in the right building," Margaret said. "To make sure the office sweep came up and you evacuated to somewhere less secure." A pause. "The restaurant was a reasonable choice. Hollis is loyal to you. I didn't interfere with that, but the unregistered device you've been using to communicate with me." She paused. "I built that device." The archive hummed around them. Elena stood in the center of it. in the center of the space her father had built to protect what the family had spent generations accumulating, and felt the ground complete its shift beneath her. Not the first shift of the night, or the second or the third. The final one. The one that reached all the way down to what she'd believed was bedrock. She thought about the 6 days she'd spent in this building after the divorce, planning, being briefed, making decisions based on Margaret's information, the timing of everything, the photograph, the compromised communication, the route to this room. Every step she'd taken tonight had been on ground that Margaret had prepared. Marcus, Elena said. Has nothing to do with this, Margaret said. Marcus Vale is a capable attorney who has been doing exactly what you think he's been doing. I let him. He's useful. A slight pause. But he's not the architect. You are. I was your father's strategist for 22 years, Margaret said. I built the succession protocol. I designed the authentication exceptions. I knew where every piece was and what every piece was worth. When your father built a system to transfer power to you, he used my architecture. He just didn't understand what he was transferring it into. Elena looked at the verification terminal behind her, at the screen that showed her contest logged, accepted, timestamp confirmed. The contest, she said, is valid, Margaret said. The filing is canceled. Your authority is confirmed. A pause that had the particular weight of a door opening onto a drop. Because I need your authority confirmed. I need you to be the legitimate holder of the Marlowe succession. I need the authentication to be real. Margaret looked at her with something that was almost maternal. Because in approximately 11 minutes, Edwin Rourke is going to present a transfer request to the verification terminal. A voluntary transfer signed by the authenticated primary authority. And the terminal is going to require your biometric confirmation to complete it. Elena understood. She stood in her family's archive and she understood. The incapacitation petition had never been the mechanism. It had been the misdirection. It had sent Elena running here, running exactly here, on a route Margaret had known she would take, through a tunnel Margaret had known she knew about, because Margaret had helped her father design the concealment. The contest had not saved her. It had delivered her. You're going to ask me to hand over the Marlowe network, Elena said. I'm going to give you the opportunity to do it willingly, Margaret said, which is considerably more dignified than the alternative. And if I don't, Margaret's expression didn't change. Then the two men behind Edwin are going to provide the biometric sample by other means. She said it the way someone described a contingency they'd prepared and hoped not to use, matter of fact. Regretful in the minimal way of someone who was not, fundamentally, sentimental about these things. I would prefer you cooperate. I have spent 31 years of my life connected to your family. I would prefer this to end cleanly. Elena looked at her hands, at the terminal, at the 4 people between her and the exit. Her phone, the third device, was in her pocket. Dante had the number. She had called Margaret from a car 40 minutes ago and told her exactly where she was going and how she was getting in. She looked at Margaret. You knew I was coming, she said. I knew you were coming when you left the restaurant, Margaret said. Hollis is loyal to you. He is also the kind of man who talks to his sister on long drives. His sister has worked in this estate's kitchen for 9 years. She called me when he told her where he was taking you. Hollis? His sister. 9 years. Elena thought about every layer she'd believed she was operating beneath, every precaution she'd taken, every person she'd verified. She thought about what her father had said once, when she was very young. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who built the room. She looked at the terminal. She looked at Margaret. And then she did something that Margaret, in 31 years of knowing Elena Marlowe, had never once seen her do. She laughed. Not hysteria. Not collapse. A short, real, entirely genuine sound. The laugh of someone who has arrived at an absurdity so complete that it briefly overrides everything else. You built all of this to get me to stand in front of a terminal and hand you something, Elena said. 12 years. The collapse of my family's organization. Watching my father spend his last years in hiding. Carver, the petition, the photograph. Breck, Victor, the timing of the divorce. All of it to get me to stand in this room. Yes, Margaret said simply. Then you don't have it yet, Elena said, and her hand moved toward her pocket. Not for the device, not for anything Margaret would have expected, but because Elena Marlowe had spent 5 years beside a man who ran one of the most dangerous organizations on the East Coast, And in 5 years of listening to things she wasn't supposed to understand, she had learned one thing above everything else. The person who seems to have no options is the person whose options haven't been accounted for yet. Her hand came out of her pocket holding nothing. That was the thing Margaret hadn't accounted for. Not a weapon, not a device, not the unregistered phone. Elena's hand came out empty, and she held it open at her side, and she looked at Margaret with an expression that Margaret spent 2 full seconds trying to read and couldn't. "You're right," Elena said. "About all of it. The architecture, the plan, the terminal." She took 1 step toward it. "But you made one miscalculation." "Tell me," Margaret said. Not dismissive, genuinely curious. That was the thing about Margaret. She had always been genuinely curious, had always treated new information as a gift, even when it was inconvenient, and it was that quality, Elena realized, that had made her so effective at long games. You had to love information more than outcome to build something over 12 years. "You needed the divorce to happen on your timeline," Elena said. "You needed me out of that house before Dante found the Veyron irregularities himself. You needed the separation before either of us could consolidate." She paused. "But the divorce was Dante's decision, not Victor's idea implanted. Dante's actual decision, made for his own reasons. Which means your timeline was contingent on a man making a choice you couldn't fully control." "Dante's decision was predictable," Margaret said. "Men like him." "Men like him have patterns," Elena said. "Yes, I know his patterns better than you do. I lived with them." She took another step. Not toward the terminal, toward the center of the room where the distance between herself and everyone else was equal. "What you couldn't control was what I did after. You assumed I would run. You assumed the first thing I would do was activate the archive and signal the Marlowe network, because that's what a strategist does when her position is exposed. She activates her resources. You did activate the archive." "I activated the archive," Elena agreed, "but I didn't signal the network." The room was quiet. One of the men behind Rourke shifted his weight, a small movement. Elena tracked it in her peripheral vision without moving her eyes. "The board notification," Margaret said. Slower now. "I told you the board had been notified." "You told me," Elena said. "I didn't verify it independently, because at that point I still trusted you." She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "The activation signal went out on your system, through the channel you control, to 12 recipients you selected." Margaret's hand, still clasped in front of her, moved slightly. A micro-adjustment, the kind that happened when a body was updating its posture in response to new information it didn't like. "The board," Elena said, "was never notified, was it?" "The notification was sent into a closed loop," Elena said. "I've had 3 hours to think in the back of a car, and in a dark kitchen, and in a tunnel under this property. Margaret, 3 hours to apply everything I know about the way you build systems to the system you told me you were activating." She stopped moving. "You couldn't afford the board to know. The board has 3 members who predate you in the Marlowe organization. 3 people my father trusted independently of his counsel. If the board received the activation signal, they would have been in contact with me directly, on channels you don't have access to. And they haven't contacted me. Perhaps they—" "Margaret," Elena's voice dropped. Not hard. Exact. "Stop." The archive hummed. Rourke had not moved. The 2 men behind him had not moved. But something in the room had changed. The specific quality of air in a space where control is shifting, and everyone present can feel it happening, and no one is certain yet which direction it's going. "The board wasn't notified," Elena said, "which means the 12 recipients of the activation signal were your 12 recipients. People you've been building relationships with for 12 years while managing my family's interests. People who believe they received a legitimate Marlowe activation and who are waiting, right now, for the follow-on instruction that would tell them what the activation means for them." She paused. "And that instruction has to come from me." "Or from the authenticated successor," Margaret said. Her voice was still level. But something had changed in it. The slight adjustment of a person who is recalculating in real time and is experienced enough to do it without fully showing the work. Which is what the transfer is. "The transfer requires my biometric authentication," Elena said. "You just said so. Which means I'm still the only person who can tell those 12 people what to do." She tilted her head slightly. "And right now, they're waiting." "Then authenticate the transfer." Or, Elena said, I send them a different instruction, an instruction that tells 12 organization heads that the Marlowe succession has been compromised, that a criminal action is in progress inside the archive, and that they should transmit that information to every affiliated network simultaneously. She paused. With the authentication code that proves it came from me, which I can generate from this terminal in about 40 seconds. The two men behind Rourke moved. Elena had expected that. What she hadn't fully expected was Margaret's hand coming up, a sharp, flat gesture, the kind that stopped trained people mid-motion, and both men stopping. The three of them looked at each other across the archive. You don't have 40 seconds, Margaret said. No, Elena agreed. I have about 4, so I'm going to need you to make a decision in the next 3. She turned to the terminal, placed her palm on the reader. The scanner engaged. She spoke the verification phrase, not the contest phrase, the operational phrase, the one her father had given her for active command communication. The terminal accepted her. Her fingers moved to the message interface. Stop, Margaret said. Behind her, she heard one of the men move. Fast. And then a sound from the main archive entrance. The crack of a door hitting a wall with force, and footsteps, and a voice she recognized. Nobody move. Dante Veyron, in the entrance to the Marlowe archive, with 3 men behind him and a face that looked like it had been through something in the last 2 hours. There was dried blood above his left eyebrow, where the cut she'd noticed earlier had apparently been reopened. His jacket was gone. His shirt had a tear at the shoulder. He'd been in a fight. He was also holding a phone extended in front of him with the screen facing the room, showing a live video feed, running, actively transmitting. Everything in this room is going to 7 recipients right now, he said, including you, including your faces, including what she just said about the activation signal. He looked at Margaret. His breathing was slightly elevated, not ragged, just elevated. The breath of a man who'd been moving fast and was now making himself be still. You want to think about your next move carefully. Margaret looked at the phone, at the feed, at the people behind Dante whose faces she was clearly cataloging. Not his usual people, Elena noted. Different faces. New faces. Victor's men, Elena said quietly, understanding arriving. Former Victor's men, Dante said. Victor and I had a conversation about an hour ago. It went better than expected once I showed him the account routing. He didn't look away from Margaret. Victor is currently explaining his full involvement to the 3 people behind me who are going to be very interested in tomorrow night's meeting. A pause. In exchange for which, Victor gets to retire to somewhere without extradition, which he feels is a reasonable outcome given the alternative. You flipped Victor, Elena said. Victor flipped himself the moment he understood Marcus had been routing the financial transfers past him. A man who thought he was going to inherit an empire does not take it well when he finds out he was going to be left with nothing. Dante's eyes moved to her. A quick assessment. She could see him checking her for damage, cataloging her situation, the same inventory process she'd watched him apply to every room he walked into. You all right? I'm functional? Good enough. He looked back at Margaret. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me, Margaret said, with the composure of someone who had lived through a great many things and was not prepared to be undone by the presence of a man with a live video feed. What you believe you've accomplished. I've accomplished the room, Dante said. The evidence that you've built. The 12 recipients who received a false activation signal and are about to receive a correction from Elena. And Victor, who is going to walk into tomorrow night's meeting and have a very different conversation with those families than the one Marcus planned. His voice was flat and direct, and had none of the performance she'd heard from him for 5 years, none of the careful construction of authority. What I haven't accomplished yet is Marcus Vale, and that's the part we need to discuss. Margaret looked at him. Then she looked at Elena. For a long moment, the archive was just the sound of its own machinery. The temperature control, the hum of hardware that had been maintained through 12 years of careful, patient, methodical betrayal. Marcus will know by morning, Margaret said finally. Victor's conversation with those men. Marcus has contacts who will reach him before the meeting. We know, Elena said. Then you understand that everything you've done in this room buys us until morning, Elena said. We know that too. She sent the correction signal to the 12 recipients, authenticated, transmitted, logged. Then she looked at Margaret. Sit down, she said. Not hard, not triumphant, the voice of someone who had run a very long distance and arrived and was now doing the next thing. Margaret sat down. They worked through the night in the archive. Elena and Dante and three of Victor's former men who had reasons of their own to want Marcus Vale's operation dismantled. Margaret sat at the far end of the room under the attention of one of the men. Not restrained, not threatened, just present, contained. Every few hours, Elena looked at her and Margaret looked back, and the thing between them was too complicated for the situation to accommodate. So they both set it aside and focused on what needed doing. By 2 a.m., they had reconstructed the full architecture of Marcus's operation. It was, Elena had to acknowledge, extraordinary work. The kind of work that required not just intelligence, but a specific personality type. Someone who could sustain malice at low temperature for over a decade without it curdling into impatience or settling into comfort. Marcus had spent 12 years maintaining the precise temperature of his ambition, never too hot to make mistakes, never cool enough to become complacent. He had 4 primary instruments: Victor, who had provided organizational access to the Veyron network; Carver, who had provided archive access to the Marlowe succession system; Breck, who had provided intelligence on Dante's internal security; and Margaret, who had been the one Elena genuinely had not seen coming. Without Margaret, the plan had significant gaps. "The meeting tomorrow night," Dante said. It was 2:40 a.m. He was sitting on the edge of a table with his arms crossed and his eyes on the document layout in front of them. Marcus will arrive expecting Victor to have announced the Veyron transition. He'll expect the Marlowe transfer to have completed through the terminal. He'll expect 2 organizations to be functionally his. Instead, he'll walk into a room where Victor has been turned, the terminal authentication failed, and the 12 families received a correction signal, Elena said. He'll know within the first 30 seconds. "So he runs," said one of the men, a broad-shouldered man named Cruz, who had worked transportation for the Veyron organization for 8 years, and who had been one of the captains that resigned and was now, with the specific flexibility of people who are primarily loyal to outcomes, present and cooperative. He sees the room and he runs. "He can't run," Elena said. "Not immediately. The meeting has been called as mandatory attendance. Every major family in the city will be there. If Marcus doesn't show, it signals that he knows something is wrong, which signals to every family that they've been part of a play they didn't consent to." She paused. Marcus's entire leverage depends on the perception that he's in control of the situation. If he runs, he loses that. "So he shows up," Dante said. "He shows up and tries to salvage it." She looked at the document layout. "Which means we need to be ready for what salvage looks like." "What does it look like?" Cruz said. "It looks like Marcus Vale walking into that room and telling 11 crime families that Dante Veyron attempted a hostile consolidation of the Marlowe network using forged documents, and that the evidence he's about to present proves it." She looked at Dante. "He's had 12 years to build a counter-narrative, one that positions him as the person who uncovered the scheme rather than the person who ran it." Dante was quiet for a moment. "The counter-narrative requires evidence." "He has evidence," Elena said. "Fabricated, but sophisticated. He's been building it alongside the real operation, 2 parallel archives. One that documents what actually happened, and one that documents a version where the roles are reversed." "How do you know that?" Dante said. "Because it's what I would do," she said. "If you're building a 12-year operation, you build your exit at the same time you build your entrance. You construct the version of history you need before you need it, so that when the moment comes, the documents already have age on them." The archive hummed around them. "Then we need his archive," Dante said. "His physical archive, yes. The fabricated evidence. If we walk into that meeting without it, we can present everything we have, and Marcus can present his counterversion, and the families will have 2 stories and no clear way to choose between them." She paused. "Families that uncertain don't take sides. They wait. And while they wait, Marcus's remaining assets move." "Where's the archive?" Cruz said. "His office," Dante said. "He has a private office separate from the Veyron facilities. Independent premises." He looked at Elena. "I've been there once, 2 years ago. He showed me the security." He paused. "He showed me the security." "He showed you," Elena said. "So that you would understand it wasn't worth trying. Or so that I would remember exactly what it looked like." Dante looked at Cruz. 12-floor building. His office is on 9. Private security, 2-person rotation. Biometric entry on the office itself. The archive room inside has a separate lock, mechanical, old-fashioned, the kind you need a key for. He looked at Elena. Why would a man who builds sophisticated digital systems use a mechanical lock on the most important room? Because sophisticated digital systems leave logs, Elena said, and a mechanical lock leaves nothing. They looked at each other across the table. We have 6 hours until the building's security rotation changes, Dante said. The gap in the rotation is 11 minutes. You memorized his rotation. I memorized everything he showed me, Dante said, because that's what you do when someone tries to impress you with their security. You memorize it in case you ever need to get through it. He stood up. I need 2 people who are comfortable in a building they're not supposed to be in. I need the mechanical lock addressed. And I need... He looked at Elena. I need you here, running the communication stream, managing the 12 recipients, making sure Margaret stays exactly where she is. You're going yourself, Elena said. Yes. I know what it is, he said. I'm going anyway. She looked at him, at the dried blood above his eyebrow and the torn shoulder and the particular way he was standing, forward-weighted, already operational, already somewhere ahead of the moment. She thought about 5 years of watching him from across the distance she'd maintained, the careful architecture of not quite knowing him. She thought about the fact that he'd walked into this archive tonight through the main entrance when every rational calculation said the risk was too high. Dante, she said. He looked at her. Don't die in Marcus Vale's building, she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, adjacent to one. I'll put it on the list. He left with Cruz and one other man at 3:15 a.m. Hot. The building was a 12-floor glass and steel structure in the financial district that looked, from the outside, like every other building of its type. The kind of architecture designed to communicate legitimacy through sheer resemblance to other legitimate things. Dante had been inside it twice, once with Marcus, once for a meeting that Marcus had arranged on neutral premises. He knew the lobby, he knew the elevator bank. He knew that the 9th floor had a small reception area with a desk that was unmanned after 7 p.m. and a corridor that led to 3 offices, the furthest of which was Marcus's. What he hadn't told Elena was that getting to the office wasn't the problem. Getting out of it was. The building's security rotation had an 11-minute gap. He'd been accurate about that. What he hadn't mentioned was that the gap required them to be on the 9th floor before the gap opened, which meant entering the building 40 minutes earlier through the service entrance and spending that 40 minutes in a stairwell on the 8th floor, waiting. 40 minutes in a stairwell was 40 minutes for everything to go wrong. He sat on the 8th floor landing with his back against the wall, and Cruz beside him and a man named Taft on the step below, and he thought about Marcus Vale, about 11 years of lunches and meetings, and the specific texture of the man's competence, the way he answered questions, always slightly ahead of where the question was going, always positioned so that his knowledge seemed like a service he was providing. The way he'd been in the room during the Marlowe collapse discussions. The particular attentiveness of someone who wasn't gathering intelligence because they had an agenda, or so it appeared, but because gathering intelligence was simply what careful people did. He thought about the moment, somewhere in the last 12 years, when Marcus had decided that being the most competent person in someone else's room was no longer enough. He thought about what that decision cost. At 3:57 a.m., the rotation gap opened. They moved fast and quiet up the stairwell, through the 9th floor door down the corridor. The reception desk was empty. The furthest office door was biometric. Dante pressed a device against the panel that one of Victor's men had provided, a reader that had cost more than most people's cars, and that cycled through credential simulations until one matched. It took 90 seconds. In a gap of 11 minutes, 90 seconds was significant. The office smelled of leather and old paper and the specific staleness of a space that was used but not inhabited. A working space, not a living space. Marcus did not bring himself here. He brought his work. The inner door was mechanical, a deadbolt. Taft had the lock addressed in 40 seconds. Not picked, removed, the whole mechanism extracted with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done this enough times that it had become a craft. Inside, shelving, filing, the physical archive. Dante moved through it fast, not searching blindly, looking for a specific type of container. Marcus would have organized the fabricated counter-narrative separately from his operational records. The operational records would be integrated, cross-referenced, indexed, the working documents of an active plan. The fabricated evidence would be isolated because it was a contingency. You kept contingencies separate from operations. He found it in 12 minutes, a fireproof box, locked with a combination. Taft started on the combination and Dante turned around and found Marcus Vale standing in the doorway of the archive room, fully dressed, composed, holding nothing. "I wondered when you'd get here," Marcus said. The three of them went still. Marcus looked at Dante with the expression he'd always had, the slight, evaluative attentiveness of a man who is always measuring. "I've had a secondary alert on this office for 6 years. Motion sensor, separate system, wired to my phone." He glanced at the fireproof box. "The combination is 1874. You don't need to damage it." He stepped into the room. "I want to talk to you, Dante. That's why I came. I could have sent people." "You sent people," Dante said, "to the archive." "That was Margaret's operation," Marcus said without any particular emphasis. "I've been managing Margaret for a long time. She believes she's been managing me." He said it without satisfaction, just accuracy, the way you stated a fact about weather. "She built the 12-year plan, not me. I've been walking alongside it and occasionally adjusting its direction." He paused. "I did not send 2 men to physically compel Elena Marlowe in her family's archive. That was Margaret exceeding her brief." "Your brief," Dante said. "The brief I've been walking alongside, yes." Marcus stood with his hands loose at his sides, his posture the posture of a man having a business conversation. "I am not the architect of this. I want to be clear about that. I am the person who has been ensuring that the architecture serves a specific end." "What end?" "Stability," Marcus said. "Genuine stability. Not the kind that comes from one family dominating the others. That's what everyone calls stability when they mean they've won. The kind that comes from the structural elimination of the systems that allow consolidation to happen in the first place." He paused. "Your organization, the Marlowe Network, Victor's Coalition, I have spent 12 years positioning myself to be the person who dismantles all of it, not to replace it, to end it." The archive room was very small with 4 people in it. "You expect me to believe," Dante said, "that a man who spent 12 years building a criminal operation to take down criminal operations is what?" Marcus said. "Sincere? No. I don't expect you to believe I'm sincere. I expect you to look at the evidence that Elena is currently reviewing in the Marlowe archive and determine that the structure of my operation does not lead where Margaret told her it leads." He looked at Dante with the calm of someone who has prepared for this conversation thoroughly. "I was the leak. The investigation file that was reviewed this morning. I requested that review. I have been building a federal case against every major family in this city for 4 years, using everything I've had access to." He paused. "Including information from the Veyron organization." Dante felt it, the specific cold of information arriving faster than the body can warm it. "You've been building a case against me," Dante said. "Against everyone," Marcus said. "But yes, including you." He paused. "The meeting tomorrow night. Every family that attends is walking into a room that has been wired, monitored, and prepared for evidence collection. Victor's announcement, the succession transfer, all of it on record." He looked at Dante steadily. "I don't need the fireproof box. The box is the contingency for a situation where the operation goes wrong. The operation has not gone wrong." He paused. "Until tonight, when you and Elena Marlowe began systematically taking apart the components." He said it without accusation. Almost, Elena would have said if she'd been there, with something like respect. "You've been more effective than I expected." Dante looked at him. "If you walk out of this building tonight," Marcus said, "with that box, and you take it to tomorrow's meeting, and you expose what you believe is my operation, you will be exposing a 12-year federal evidence-building process. You will be handing every family in that room the information they need to disappear before they can be held accountable." He paused. "And you will have spent 12 years of work and 5 years of your wife's life and everything you've both given up tonight to hand organized crime in this city a clean escape." Dante stood in the small room with that. His hand was resting on top of the fireproof box. Taft and Cruz were completely still. "Prove it," Dante said. Marcus reached into his jacket, and handed Dante a federal identification card with a photograph that was unmistakably Marcus Vale's face, above a title that Dante read twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. In the thin pre-dawn light of a private archive room that smelled of leather and paper, and 12 years of a game that had just revealed one more layer beneath the layer they'd thought was the bottom. Senior Intelligence Officer. Dante looked at the card. Then he looked at Marcus Vale. "You're going to need to make a call," Marcus said quietly, "before that meeting starts." And outside the building, the city moved toward morning without knowing that in a room on the 9th floor of a glass and steel building in the financial district, two men were standing over a fireproof box that contained either the evidence that would end everything or the contingency that would save it, and neither of them yet knew which one they were holding. Dante looked at the card for a long time, not because he needed more time to read it. The words were simple, and the photograph was clear, and the agency seal was the kind of thing that either was real or was the most expensive forgery he'd ever held, and he'd held some expensive forgeries in his time. He looked at it because he was doing the thing he did, applying the new information to every memory that contained Marcus Vale and watching the picture change, and there were 11 years of memories to apply it to, and the picture changed in ways that were disorienting in their completeness. Every meeting, every carefully measured answer, every moment of competence that had read as loyalty to the Veyron organization. 11 years of a man sitting in rooms that Dante controlled and being the smartest person in them, and making sure Dante never felt threatened by that, making sure the competence felt like a service, like a tool being offered, not a mind that was running its own calculations underneath. He set the card down on top of the fireproof box. "How long?" he said. "I was placed inside the Veyron organization 9 years ago," Marcus said. 2 years after I'd established enough of a track record in the legitimate legal world to make the introduction credible. He paused. "The Marlowe connection, what I know about their succession architecture, the collapse, all of it, that predates the placement. I worked that case from the outside. When your organization started looking at Marlowe territory, my placement was accelerated. Because you needed someone inside both worlds. Because the case required visibility into both networks. Neither one could be fully documented without access to the other." Marcus stood in the same posture he'd maintained through the entire conversation. Hands loose, weight even, the posture of someone who was not performing calm but who had been in enough high-pressure situations that calm was simply what his body defaulted to. Margaret Howe built the 12-year plan independently. She is not an operative. She is a woman who spent 22 years loyal to Thomas Marlowe, watched his organization destroyed, and decided the destruction was an opportunity. Her motivations are genuinely her own. "And you walked alongside her operation," Dante said. "Adjusted its direction," you said. "Where her plan and my case intersected, yes. Where they diverged, I managed the divergence." He looked at Dante steadily. "I did not fabricate evidence against you. Everything in the federal case is accurate. Everything you did, the organization you ran, the operations, the decisions, it's documented, real. I want you to understand that clearly before you make your decision." The room was quiet. Cruz had his arms crossed and was looking at the floor in the way of a man who was processing information that significantly complicated his situation. Taft was very still on the lock mechanism he'd extracted, holding it in both hands like something he'd forgotten he was carrying. Dante looked at the box. "The meeting," he said. "Starts in 6 hours, Marcus said. "Every major family. Victor arriving to announce the Veyron transition, which is now, as you've managed tonight, not going to happen the way it was planned. The room will be expecting the announcement. When it doesn't materialize as designed, the families will be unsettled. Unsettled families are unpredictable." He paused. "I need the meeting to proceed in a controlled manner. I need what was planned to happen in that room, the evidence presentation, the consolidation announcement, to happen in a form that serves the case rather than destroying it." "You want me to walk into that meeting," Dante said. "I want you and Elena Marlowe to walk into that meeting," Marcus said, "with everything you've built tonight. And I want you to do what you were going to do anyway. Expose the operation, present the evidence, demonstrate the scope of what was being planned. I want every family in that room to understand that their participation in Victor's coalition, their financial ties to the network Margaret built, their communications with Carver, all of it is documented." He paused. "Because the difference between them hearing that from you and hearing it from a federal indictment 6 months from now, is that if they hear it from you in that room, on record, with the audio and video collection already in place, they don't have time to construct a response. They react. And reactions are evidence in ways that prepared statements are not. Dante picked up the federal identification card again. "You're asking me to do your job for you," he said. "I'm asking you to do something that serves both of us," Marcus said. "You want these families to understand that the world they've been operating in is finished. I want them on record, acknowledging that they knew what they were participating in. Those are the same thing." He paused. "And in exchange, I need to tell you something about the case as it currently stands." "Tell me." "Your cooperation tonight, the evidence you've gathered, the testimony Victor is currently providing, the archive material Elena has documented. If presented formally, it constitutes substantial assistance, the kind that changes the shape of individual exposure significantly." He said it precisely, the way he said everything, not as a promise, as a statement of legal fact. "I can't make guarantees, I want to be clear about that. What I can tell you is that the case as currently constructed, with the assistance you've provided, creates a significantly different set of outcomes than the case without it." Dante set the card down again. He thought about Elena in the archive, alone with Margaret and Rourke, and the complexity of what had just been added to an already complicated night. He needed to call her. He needed to tell her what was in the 9th floor archive room. Not just the box, but the man, and the card, and the 12 years underneath the 12 years. "I need to make a call," he said. "Yes," Marcus said. "You do." Elena picked up before the first ring finished. "I was about to call you," she said. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who had been awake for too long and was running on something more fundamental than alertness. "Margaret just told me something." "Tell me after," Dante said. "I need you to listen first." He told her. He told her everything Marcus had said, in the order Marcus had said it, without editorial, because he'd learned in the last 5 years, learned slowly and badly and too late in some respects, that Elena processed information better without his interpretation layered over it. He told her about the card, the placement, the federal case, the 9 years, the meeting and what Marcus wanted from it and what Marcus was offering in return. When he finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that he checked the connection. "Elena?" "I'm here," she said. "I'm thinking." He waited. Outside the building's narrow window at the end of the corridor, the sky was beginning to do what skies did before dawn. Not lightning exactly, but losing some of its depth, the darkness becoming slightly less absolute. "Margaret," Elena said finally, "told me something while you were gone, before she understood how much we already knew." A pause. "She told me that the Marlowe collapse, the betrayal that destroyed my father's organization 12 years ago, wasn't internal. It was external. Someone provided detailed intelligence on the internal structure to a rival consortium, specifically to create the appearance of an internal betrayal. The mole was real, but the mole was handled. The information that actually caused the collapse came from outside." "From Marcus," Dante said. "From a federal operation," Elena said. "That was dismantling organized crime networks on the East Coast 12 years ago. That collected intelligence on the Marlowe organization as part of a broader case, and whose intelligence was leaked, not by design, by a compromised intermediary, to a rival consortium who used it to trigger the collapse." A pause. "My father didn't die because of an internal betrayal. He went into hiding because a federal intelligence leak destroyed his organization, and he couldn't tell the difference between the leak and a conspiracy." Dante pressed his back against the corridor wall. "Marcus didn't destroy your family," he said. "A broken chain of custody in a federal evidence room destroyed my family," Elena said. Her voice was completely level. He'd learned that her voice was most level when what was underneath it was most complicated. "Marcus's predecessor operation, a different case, a different era, but the same architecture." She stopped. "He knows. He's known since he was placed inside your organization. It's why the Marlowe case was assigned to him specifically, because the agency had a culpability problem and they needed someone who could document the current state of the Marlowe network while simultaneously building toward an outcome that could be framed as resolution rather than accountability for what they did." Silence. They broke your family, Dante said quietly, and then they sent someone to fix it in a way that never required them to admit that. Yes, Elena said. The corridor was very still. Does that change what you want to do? Dante said. The pause was shorter than he expected. No, she said. It changes what I understand. It doesn't change what needs to happen. Another pause. But I want it on record, everything, including the original leak, including the culpability. Her voice had an edge now. Not anger, something more precise than anger, the specific edge of a person who has decided what they want and is not going to be argued out of it. If Marcus wants our cooperation at that meeting, he documents the original case failure. He puts it in the record, not buried, accessible, a part of the formal case history. Dante looked at Marcus through the open door of the archive room. She wants the original leak documented, he said, in the formal record. Marcus was quiet for a moment, a long moment for a man who processed things quickly. That's not a small ask. No, Dante said, it's not. Another silence. Then Marcus said, tell her it will be done. Dante wasn't certain it was a promise that could be kept. He suspected Elena wasn't certain either. But he also knew that Marcus Vale had spent 12 years keeping complicated things in motion without them collapsing, and that a man with that track record treated commitments as load-bearing structures. It will be done, Dante told her. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Tell him we'll be at the meeting, she said. Well, the meeting was held in a building that had once been a private dining club. High ceilings, old wood paneling, the smell of money that had been in the same rooms for generations. 11 families. 37 people in the main hall when Dante walked in at 7:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the stated start time, with Elena beside him and Cruz behind him, and the particular quality of entrance that came from 2 people who had not slept and had nothing left to protect except the thing they'd decided to do. The room noticed them immediately. Not just Dante. Elena. Elena walking into a room full of people who had heard, in the last 18 hours, that the Marlowe archive had been activated and deactivated and contested and corrected, who had received communications from 12 organization heads that something had gone wrong with a plan they'd been partially briefed on, who had spent the night revising their understanding of their own exposure. They knew who she was now, or they knew enough to understand that they hadn't known before, and that the difference between those 2 states was significant. Victor was already in the room. He sat near the back wall with the posture of a man who had agreed to something and was now in the process of living with it. He looked older than he'd looked 2 days ago. He didn't look at Dante when Dante came in. Margaret was not in the room. She was in the Marlowe archive with 2 people who were not her people, and she would remain there until the relevant authorities arrived, which Marcus had indicated would be later that morning. Elena had not spoken to her after the phone call. She wasn't ready to speak to her yet. She wasn't sure when she would be, or if the word ready was even applicable to whatever that conversation was going to be. Edwin Rourke was not in the room either. Rourke had, it turned out, been living under an arrangement with Margaret for 6 years, housed, supported, kept available for the specific moment he'd been brought to the archive for. When the moment didn't materialize the way it was planned, when Elena contested the filing and sent the correction signal, and the 2 men in the archive recognized that the situation had changed, Rourke had cooperated with a speed that suggested he'd been looking for an exit from the arrangement for some time. Marcus was in the room. He was sitting at the far end, unremarkable, the way he'd always been unremarkable, present and capable, and entirely invisible as a threat until you knew what you were looking at. Dante stood at the front of the room and waited for it to settle. It settled. The way rooms settled when people understood that what was coming was not what they'd been told to expect. You were invited here tonight, Dante said, for an announcement about the future of the Veyron organization and the Marlowe network. I'm going to give you that announcement. It's just not the one Victor planned. He laid it out. Not theatrically. Not with the performance of a man demonstrating power. He was past that, had been past it since the dark kitchen, since the corridor outside Breck's sweep, since the tunnel under the Marlowe estate that Elena had walked through while he was driving to Victor's location, with his hands tight on the wheel and his mind on a problem that kept revealing new floors. He laid it out the way you laid out a structure when you wanted people to understand it, not be impressed by it. The coalition Victor had built, the Marlowe succession plan and the archive access Carver had facilitated. Margaret Howe and the 12-year architecture. The incapacitation petition and the terminal and what had happened in the archive last night. He paused there. Elena took over. She spoke for 11 minutes. He watched the room while she spoke, watched faces, watched the specific quality of attention that moved through people when they understood that information they're receiving has direct consequences for their own situation. Some of them had known pieces of what she was describing. Most of them had known they were involved in something larger than what Victor had presented to them, and had chosen not to ask the questions that would have made them uncomfortable. The specific moral flexibility of people who operate in arrangements where not knowing is a professional skill. She watched them understand that the not knowing was over. When she finished, the room was the kind of quiet that had weight to it. Then a man named Caruso ran port operations out of New Jersey, had been in the business since before Dante was born, was the kind of person whose opinion in a room like this functioned as a tide, said, "What are you asking from us?" "Nothing," Elena said. "We're not asking anything. We're informing you that the operation you were brought into has been dismantled. We're informing you that the evidence of your participation in it exists and is documented. What you do with that information is your own business." She paused. "But every decision you make from this moment is being made with full knowledge, which means it's yours." Caruso looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dante. Then he looked at the far end of the room, where Marcus Vale was sitting with the stillness of someone who had waited a very long time for a specific moment and was now inside it. "The lawyer," Caruso said. "Who's the lawyer?" "Someone who's been in this business longer than any of us," Dante said, "in a different capacity." The room processed that. The way rooms process things they already half knew. Not with shock, but with the particular adjustment of people setting down one version of events and picking up another. What happened next took 40 minutes and was not dramatic in the way that climaxes were supposed to be dramatic. People made phone calls. Some people left the room. Some people stayed and had conversations with each other in low voices. One man, a family head from upstate who had been the most financially invested in Victor's coalition, sat in his chair for 20 minutes without speaking, and then stood up and walked to where Marcus was sitting and had a conversation that lasted 6 minutes, and at the end of which the man sat back down and looked at the table in front of him with the expression of someone who had just made a decision they wouldn't be able to take back. Victor left at 8:47. He walked past Dante without stopping, without looking at him, with the gait of a man who had made his arrangement and was now executing it. At the door he paused for exactly 1 second, and his head turned slightly, not enough to be a look, just enough to indicate that some part of him had wanted to say something and had decided against it. Then he was gone. Elena watched him go. She thought about the dining room and the papers and the ring, about the 23 minutes between signing her name and the moment the first Rolls-Royce appeared on the wet road, about 5 years of managing the geometry of a life she'd built inside someone else's, without either of them understanding what the other was doing. She thought about the fact that she'd married Dante Veyron because she believed the potential was there. Not the potential to change him, she wasn't that naive and never had been, but the potential that he already contained and hadn't yet found the circumstances to use. She'd been wrong about the timeline. She'd been wrong about a lot of the specifics. She hadn't been wrong about that. At 9:15, the room was mostly empty. Dante came to stand beside her. Not close, the appropriate distance of two people who were no longer what they'd been and hadn't yet determined what they were now. He looked at the empty chairs, at the wood paneling, at the old building that had held a lot of conversations over its lifetime and would hold more. "Breck," he said. "When I got back to the building last night, he was waiting." She looked at him. "He tried to stop me from leaving," Dante said. "Not with particular emotion, just the fact of it. We had a disagreement about that." "The cut," she said. "Mostly the shoulder," he said. "Breck is still useful when he wants to be." She looked at the torn shoulder seam she'd noticed in the archive, now that she could see it clearly in actual light. He'd been walking around all night with a shoulder that had been grabbed or wrenched and hadn't mentioned it and hadn't adjusted his posture to accommodate it, which was either discipline or stubbornness, and was probably both. "Is he in custody?" she said. "By now, yes. And the surveillance device is in your office. Breck gave us the full inventory before he stopped being cooperative." A pause. "There were 11 of them, some going back 4 years." 4 years of meetings, of conversations, of plans made in a room that was transmitting them to a man who was building a parallel history out of everything overheard. She breathed through that. Marcus, she said, is going to do what he said. Dante's voice carried something she recognized as the specific register of a man who wasn't certain but had decided to operate as though he were. The original case failure, the leak that destroyed your family, he's going to document it. You believe him? I believe he understands what happens if he doesn't, Dante said, which is close enough to belief for me to work with. She almost smiled at that. Not quite. Something in the neighborhood of it. Marcus himself left the building at 9:30 with two people she didn't recognize and whom she understood she wasn't supposed to recognize. He passed them on his way out and stopped for a moment, just a moment, in the way of a man who had places to be and had allocated a specific number of seconds for this. The Foundation, he said. He was looking at Elena. The Marlowe Network's legitimate assets. There are more of them than you've had time to fully inventory. What happens to them matters to the case outcome. He paused. I'd like to suggest that what happens to them also matters to something larger, but that's not my suggestion to make. He left. Elena looked at the door he'd gone through. He knows what you're going to do, Dante said. He's known for a while, she said. He's been building the case in a shape that assumed it. He assumed you'd dismantle the network. He assumed I'd do what my father would have done if he'd had the space and the time to make the choice without a knife at his throat. She looked at Dante. My father didn't build the succession protocol to preserve an empire. He built it to preserve the option of ending one responsibly. He just didn't live long enough to do it himself. The room was empty now, except for them. What? It took 4 months. Not the legal architecture, that moved at its own pace and would continue moving for years, through proceedings that Elena participated in and Dante cooperated with, and that ground along with the specific indifference of institutional systems that are large enough to be impersonal about individual lives. That was its own process, and it had its own timeline, and she'd made her peace with not controlling it. The 4 months were for the other thing. The Marlowe Network's legitimate assets were more substantial than anyone outside the family had known. Her father had been meticulous about separating the legal from the illegal, in part out of practicality, and in part, she'd come to understand, out of a belief that the legal portion might outlast him in a useful way. Shipping infrastructure, real estate holdings in 6 cities, a logistics operation that had been running on legitimate contracts for 8 years, staffed by people who didn't know the name Marlowe and had never been asked to do anything that crossed a line. A financial instrument that had been accruing value quietly for a decade. She spent 4 months converting it. Not selling it, converting it. Restructuring the assets into the infrastructure of a foundation that would do the specific thing she'd watched the people around her fail to do for her entire adult life. Provide actual support to the families that organized crime left behind. Not rehabilitation programs with waiting lists. Not hotlines. Actual support, legal, financial, logistical, the kind that required the same organizational competence that had built the systems that damaged people in the first place. She worked 14 hours a day and slept badly and ate when she remembered to. And the work was harder than anything she'd done before because it required a different muscle. Not the muscle of managing threats in reading rooms and staying invisible while staying essential, but the muscle of building something that was supposed to last after she stopped being the one maintaining it. Dante dismantled the Veyron network on his own timeline and in his own way, which was messier than hers and more costly in certain respects. And she knew about it in the general sense of someone who is operating in the same ecosystem without being in the same room. He cooperated with Marcus's case extensively. She knew that because Marcus told her when their monthly documentation meetings required it, in the flat informational way that Marcus told you things, when the things were facts rather than suggestions. She heard from Dante twice during those 4 months. Once was a text message, a photograph, no caption, of the Calderon Estates dining room with the table completely empty and the chairs stacked against the wall. She understood what it meant. She didn't respond to it, not because she had nothing to say, but because what she had to say required more than a text message, and she wasn't ready to say it in the medium of more than a text message. The second time was a phone call, 3 months in. He called at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. She picked up because she'd been awake anyway. The estate, he said. I'm selling it. Okay, she said. I wanted you to know. Okay? A pause. I don't know why I wanted you to know. I just did. She looked at the ceiling of her office in the foundation building. An old building, not as old as the Marlowe estate, but old enough to have the character of a place that had been many things and was currently being something new. Where are you going? I don't know yet, he said. I've been doing a thing my whole life, and now I'm not doing it, and I haven't figured out what comes next. He said it without self-pity, just description. I didn't expect it to feel like this. Like what? Like standing in a room where the furniture's been moved and you keep reaching for things that aren't where they were. She was quiet for a moment. That gets better, she said. Slowly, but it gets better. You sound like you know. I've been doing it for 4 months, she said. The call lasted another 12 minutes and covered nothing in particular. The sale logistics, a question about the estate's grounds that she couldn't answer, a brief mention of Victor's formal cooperation agreement and what it contained. Practical things. The kind of conversation that two people have when they have larger things to say and are not yet ready to say them, and both of them know it, and neither of them pretends otherwise. She hung up and sat in her office for a while. She thought about the theater and the handshake, about the archive and Margaret's face in the full lights, about a federal identification card lying on top of a fireproof box in a room that smelled of leather and paper and time, about the photograph of an empty dining room. She thought about what her father had said about the succession protocol, not the legal language, the thing behind it, that he'd built it to give her a choice, that the choice he'd wanted her to have was the one she'd made, that he'd been afraid she wouldn't get to make it. She thought about what it cost to get here and whether the cost had been fair, and understood that fairness was not the right frame. It had been what it was. It had ended the way it ended. The people who deserved worse than they got were numerous, and the people who got worse than they deserved were numerous. And in between those two categories was the ordinary difficult truth of a world where outcomes were the result of action and circumstance in roughly equal measure, and the best you could do was act well and accept the circumstance. She was not certain she had always acted well. She was certain she had acted. The last time she saw Dante was the following month, at the signing for the Calderon estate transfer. He was already there when she arrived. She didn't know why she'd been invited exactly, except that the buyer's attorney had requested confirmation of certain Veyron-Marlowe asset separations from the divorce settlement, which was a document she'd signed 5 weeks ago in a different lawyer's office in 15 minutes that felt very different from the 5 weeks it had taken to prepare. She wasn't there long. The attorney asked 3 questions. She answered them. The relevant documents were signed. Dante walked her to the door. They stood for a moment on the steps of the attorney's building. It was afternoon, clear and cold, the particular bright cold of a city in late autumn that made everything look slightly more itself than it usually did. He looked good. Not recovered. She didn't think recovered was the right word for where either of them were, but grounded in a way he hadn't been during the worst of it. Something behind his eyes had settled, the way things settled when you've stopped fighting on every front simultaneously and started understanding which battles are actually yours. The foundation, he said. It's running, she said, slowly. But it's running. He nodded, looked past her at the street. I've been talking to someone about what it looked like, the organization, the decisions. He paused. Not legally, personally. Someone who asks questions I don't have automatic answers to. She understood what that meant and what it had cost him to say it. That's good, she said. It's uncomfortable, he said. That's the same thing, she said. He looked at her then. The full look, the one she'd spent 5 years receiving only in fragments. The inventory look, but turned all the way up, taking in everything without flinching from what he saw or editing what it made him feel. She had never seen him look at anything that way. She wasn't sure he'd known he was capable of it until recently. I know what I threw away, he said, when I signed those papers. I want you to know I understand what I threw away. She looked at him steadily. I know you do. That's not the same as it being fixable. No, she said, it's not. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have said the true things and are living in the space after them where there's nothing left to manage or protect or carefully arrange. Just the thing itself, whatever it was. Are you going to be all right? She said. Eventually, he said. You? Eventually, she said. She went down the steps. Behind her, she heard him stay where he was for a moment. She could feel it, the particular quality of someone standing still while you walk away, not calling after you, not moving to follow, just being present in the way you're present for the end of something that mattered. She didn't look back. Not from coldness, not from unresolved anger or the armor of pride or any of the things that make people walk away without looking back in the dramatic sense of those words. She didn't look back because there was nothing in that direction that required looking. Everything that needed to be seen had been seen. Everything that needed to be said had been said or had been shown through the way they'd moved and chosen and survived the last months of something that had been, in its damaged and complicated way, real. The car was at the corner. Hollis was at the wheel, reading something on his phone, and he looked up when she came down the sidewalk and started the engine without being asked, because he'd been doing this long enough to know what departure looked like. She got in. The city moved past the windows. The clear, cold afternoon light made the buildings look like they were paying attention. She let herself be in it for a moment, just in it, in the movement and the light and the ordinary sound of a city that didn't know anything about the last 6 months and was proceeding on that basis, which was its right. She thought about the 32 black Rolls-Royces in the rain. She thought about how it had felt to walk out of the Calderon estate with one suitcase, and how she'd told herself in the car that night that she was not going to measure the next stage of her life by what she was leaving. She'd meant it then, and she meant it now. The foundation had a board meeting in the morning. There was a logistics review in the afternoon. In the evening, she had dinner with 3 women who ran a legal advocacy organization that the foundation was partnering with. Women who'd been doing this work for years without the kind of resources that had just become available to them, and who were cautiously allowing themselves to believe that the resources were real. She had things to do. The car moved through the city, and the light shifted, and the afternoon became evening in the way that autumn afternoons became evening, quickly, without ceremony, the day simply becoming the next thing. Elena Marlowe sat in the back of a car that had no convoy behind it, and no destination that required security, and no agenda for the night, beyond the ordinary demands of a life that was being built rather than maintained, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately trace, something that was not relief and not triumph, and not the specific absence of dread that she'd sometimes mistaken for peace. She felt like herself. Not a version of herself calibrated for a room or relationship or a war. Just herself. That was enough. That, she had learned, was the only thing that had ever been enough. The car turned east toward a part of the city she was just beginning to know, and the lights came on one by one in the buildings as the evening arrived, and the street filled with people going somewhere, and she was one of them.